Hi, good evening. This is our series on environment, animal issues, and we are bringing in today Professor Aleksandra Cavoski from University of Birmingham Law School. She's going to speak on climate change and other things. She is a professor of law in the University of Birmingham Law School. Professor Cavoski, thank you so much for joining us, and it's a pleasure. Absolutely. Would you like to just do a small introduction and start with the LLM part of your university and then move to the topic? Is that fine with you?
Yeah, that sounds great. So thank you very much for your invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. So my name, as you said, it's Aleksandra Cavoski. I'm professor of law at Birmingham Law School, University of Birmingham. And my area of research is environmental law. So I'm particularly interested in EU environmental law, some aspects of international environmental law. And I'm also particularly interested to see how environmental law intersects with many other disciplines such as politics, public policy, science, and others. So I'm very interested in those intersections. I'm also a college director for Arts and Humanities College within University of Birmingham. So also I'm very happy to be here in that capacity because University of Birmingham is a very international university and welcomes students from around the world. So before I start with the lecture, I just want to say a few words about the LLM program that we have. And I will try to share the screen now. Just bear with me a moment. Let me just start from the beginning. So I just want to say a few words first about the University of Birmingham. So you will see from this photo that we're very proud of our campus, which is in very central in Birmingham. This is another photo that you can see. This is a really a quite large campus. And just a few words about University of Birmingham. This is a really very international, highly ranked university in the UK. As you can see it from the screen, it's ranked as the 81st university in QS rankings, and it's the 15th in the UK. And this is an average population. So I would say that we have, this is the figure, the last figure that we have 33,800 total student population. And you can see it from that number that actually a large number are essentially our international students, and we're very proud to have a huge international cohort, including students coming from India as well. We're one of the Russell Group universities. Actually, we're one of the founding members of the Russell Group. What is also, we're very proud of teaching excellence. And for those of you who don't know, there is something which is called the Teaching Excellence Framework in the UK, where you are assessed with regard to your teaching, and we have been very fortunate to get gold, which is a testament to hard work. We have two campuses, so we have Edgbaston campus, which is our main campus, but we are also in the last 2 years developing a campus in Dubai. So these are just a few bits of information about Birmingham. So you can see Birmingham is located quite centrally, which is actually quite convenient in terms of traveling and seeing other places. This is the second largest city in the UK. And one thing which is really important for those who might be thinking of coming to the UK and to Birmingham is that it's very close to London. It will be 1 hour 20 minutes, but sometimes 1 hour 15 minutes to London. So it's really very well connected. I also want to say for international students, one of the things to bear in mind, it's also the proximity to Birmingham International Airport. So from Edgbaston, from our campus, to get to International Airport, it takes 15 to 20 minutes. So this is really very close. And you can see another fact here in terms of how we are located. In terms of what we offer a variety of programs, as you can see it here. So we offer I would say, nice diversity of undergraduate programs that are all listed here. And you can see they're very actually rich. And I think depends what you want to do. For those who are not really maybe in their first year, they don't really know what they want to do. Students usually choose the straight LLB in law, but there are students who are already made up their mind that they're interested in, for example, criminology, business, students who are more inclined to international law. So you could see that we have various programs that we offer. And also there's two particular programs which are quite important for students coming from the European Union. What is also important that for students who are thinking about taking postgraduate studies, which is really important, is that we offer both programs in Edgbaston, so in Birmingham, but also in our Dubai campus. And what is also important, from this year, we have a distance learning program, and I will say a few more words about the LLM that we offer. So here you can see that we have, again, also the LLM level. We offer a variety of programs. Again, students can decide which one they like. Again, there is a general LLM pathway if students are not really interested in a particular discipline, law discipline, but they want to have a general knowledge, more advanced knowledge than the one they get at their undergraduate level. But for example, if they're interested more in trade, there is international trade pathway, and you can see it, commercial, criminal, and many others. And also we run in Dubai only the LLM International Commercial Law. We started with that. As I said, this is our new campus. We're very proud of that too. One thing that may be interesting for those who are listening today, because this is a lecture about environment and energy, is that we have designed recently the LLM Energy and Environmental Law, which is a distance learning program. And I think this is quite a unique program, comprised of modules that you don't really get in very many other LLM programs. And just to say a few, for example, there is a whole module devoted to nuclear energy. There is a module devoted to climate change and renewable energy. There is a module devoted to environmental impact assessment, project finance in environmental projects. So as you can see, it's very kind of specialized modules where we essentially design coursework in a very kind of unique way. And this is running from this year. So this is our first cohort that we have at the moment. And it's very international cohort. And I have to say it's running really, really well. So we're very proud of that. And finally, we offer PhD, which could be face-to-face normal PhD, but also it could be a distance learning for those who are unable to be in the UK during their PhD studies. And again, in any area, because we have a staff covering, I would say, almost all branches of law. So depending on your interest, you can always find a suitable supervisor. And just the final thing, and then I will stop with this brief intro. This just gives you a flavor of optional modules that we have. These are optional modules at the undergraduate level. However, we have similar, but of course more advanced modules that we would be offering at the LLM level. But you can see this is really a rich list of modules that we offer. So we're actually very proud of this very rich list. And I think that all students can find something that they like. Either you can see it's such a rich list that you can be interested in private law, you can pursue that. You can be interested in international law and human rights. You can be interested in more theoretical modules, and there is always something there for everyone. So I just think this is something that it's really important to bear in mind. But that brings me to my topic, and I was thinking that it may be useful to think about changes in environment and energy regulation. Sorry, there's a bit of a mistake there. It should be environment and energy regulation in the last 20 years. So one of the things, sorry, I missed one. So one of the things to bear in mind is that if we think about environment and energy law, it's important to think what are the main drivers of change in the last 20 years. And I think we can all agree that definitely the impact of climate change was one of the drivers of the change in how we regulate environment and energy. And I think the effects of climate change are around us everywhere. And as we know, they're different depending in which part of the world we are. In some countries, such as the UK, we're unfortunately facing floods. In other countries, it could be, increasing sea levels, or it could be drought, it could be wildfires, and so on and so forth. But inevitably, the impact of climate change, I would say, was the main driver, because we have to adapt and we have to address climate change. And of course, as a result of that, we do have quite a rich activity at the national level. So the national governments are essentially taking this seriously, especially in the last decades. And we can see that at the national level, we have national climate change targets. And we'll speak about them in a minute. But this is something also that is a driver of change, because if we have a legally binding targets at the national level, we then definitely have to make changes when it comes to environmental law. And I think we shouldn't forget the international commitments. And I know that there is a lot of criticism, of course, and some of you may agree with that. There is a lot of criticism about the effectiveness of international environmental law and to what extent international commitments are drivers of change. And I fully agree with the criticism. We saw that we have from 1992, when we had the first United Nations Climate Change Framework Convention to Paris Agreement, there were lots of different events and ups and downs in essentially developing what we call today an international climate change regime. But still, there are some international commitments, and this is important. Maybe they're not as specified as we would like them to be, but I would say that international law, it is still a driver of change. Maybe not to the extent we want to have it, but it is still there, a driver of change. And I think one of the things that we can see in recent years, and I just put the UK provision as this is something that is relevant for the UK, we can definitely see that the national governments are changing the way how they regulate and deal with the impacts of climate change. And for example, this is provision from the UK Climate Change Act, where you can see that the target for 2050 should be the net zero target, so no carbon emissions by 2050. And equally, you will see that many other countries have something similar. New Zealand has a similar provision. In the EU recently, we have it's a proposal not adopted, but we have the European Climate Change Law, which is putting a similar provision. So this is essentially saying to us that definitely there is an appetite for change, and a result of those national targets, the things are moving when it comes to environmental and energy law. And I also mentioned that there are international commitments, and this is how I try to represent in a way what it is in Paris Agreement. And you will see that we have this ultimate objective to limit the temperature, but also we have various tools that the Paris Agreement is endorsing. And one is mitigation, adaptation, capacity building, transparency, technology exchange, and also some form of financial provisions. And again, we can, as I said, we can all now say that those commitments are not very firm, and it depends on states how they're going to implement it. But still, this is an important framework to bear in mind, because this is also one of the drivers of change. But how is this law change? How did we change international environmental law? So what are we seeing more and more? And I think we can see that definitely there is a great emphasis as a result of climate change to put in place national measures which will address climate change, but also national measures which will essentially allow for better deployment of renewable energy. And this is done in many different ways. So this change is coming in different ways. I think one of the things that we're seeing as a wide trend around the world, regardless of where you are, that governments are putting various institutional and governance structures in place to allow for what we said, this regulation of climate change and deployment of renewable energy. Also, what we are seeing around the world, is this proliferation of laws and policies. So we have actually more and more laws and policies at the national level which are addressing climate change in different forms and shapes, and we will talk about it in a second. But also what is important, we have concrete measures where national governments are trying, A, to mitigate climate change, and B, then to adapt to climate change. And finally, what we're seeing is that, of course, national governments are becoming more willing to invest in research and development, because without research and development, we cannot essentially address climate change. But that brings me to my first point about national institutional structures. And this varies around the world how these institutional structures will be put in place. Some countries prefer to have political bodies which will be very close to the government and which will give essentially political steer when it comes to regulation of climate change. For example, in Kenya, we have a National Climate Change Council. So this is an example of a political body. What is more widespread when it comes to regulation of climate change is the second option, advisory body. So in quite a lot of countries nowadays, we have advisory bodies which are essentially advising government on what will be the feasible targets and essentially which are monitoring how the government is implementing climate change legislation. A good example would be the UK, in the UK, where we have the Climate Change Committee, which is exactly having the same role. One thing that we're seeing everywhere in the world, that we're having more and more regulatory bodies. And again, some would argue that there is almost a proliferation of regulatory bodies. And actually, they're really important. And when it comes to environment and energy, because they're essentially those bodies which are overseeing the regulation of environmental law. Sometimes the regulatory bodies are of general nature. Usually environment agencies around the world have this role. But sometimes what is also important to note is that we have regulatory bodies which are essentially acting in specific sectors. So in the UK, for example, you have a regulatory body within the energy sector, which is essentially ensuring that energy gets to suppliers, that we're protecting the interest of consumers, and so on. But we shouldn't forget, depending on what is the organizational structure of a country, sometimes we do have decentralized bodies, which are quite important. You know, in US, these will be the states. In some countries, it will be regions, local authorities, and again, other bodies. In some countries, cities are very important. City government do have quite important powers when it comes to climate change. And I also said that one of the things that we're seeing as a change in environmental and energy regulation is the fact that we have more and more laws which are essentially regulating climate change. And they're different. Some countries like to have a framework climate change legislation. And I tried to list a few here that you can see. So if you can look at this list here, you would see that more and more countries are having Climate Change Act. And this is quite important. They put all of their mitigation adaptation measures within this Climate Change Act, which is a framework act, and then it is used as a basis for anything else. Some countries are more inclined to have constitutional provisions. So some countries would have a right to healthy environment prescribed in the constitution, and then that provides a legal basis for any further legislation. And also that provision is quite important for individuals if they want to bring an action against the state. And we saw that quite a lot in the past. And also we shouldn't forget that there are sectoral laws. So countries are passing more and more laws within specific sectors, especially energy, and those sectoral laws are quite important for regulating environment and energy. Also, what is quite important that we're seeing that countries and governments are passing various national policies, and they vary. They could be policies which are only referring to mitigation, or policies which are referring to adaptation, or policies which are referring to both of those, but just are looking at the specific sector. And the variety of options that we can see around the world. Sometimes those policies are called strategies, sometimes they're called action plans, but these are essentially important documents which are essentially setting various targets and setting the future action for each government. What is also important to note is that all the governments are now trying to set climate change targets. And this is really important. And it's done in different ways. Some countries tend to have the ultimate target usually by 2050. And as I said, that then the trend now is becoming that it's a zero net target by 2050. Some countries are using this method of deploying what is called a carbon budget, where essentially you are gradually getting to that 2050 target, and then you're setting targets throughout a certain period. And this is an example of a UK carbon budget, as you can see it. That first carbon budget was covering a period of 2008-2012, and then you set your target for that particular time period. And that kind of gradual carbon budgets allow you to get to your 2050 target in an easier manner. But also this is important because you can make your government more accountable, because there are those intermediate targets that you can follow. But as I said, this is the UK example. Also, what is important to note is that besides putting in place, national laws, besides putting in place national policies, besides putting in place various institutional structures, is that the government is also every government is also deploying various regulatory approaches. And one that we're all familiar with is what is called the command and control approach, where essentially the government is setting usually various standards, and then through the enforcement of those standards, then the government is essentially trying to mitigate and to address climate change. And so if we think about command and control, we can always think about various emission standards. So, emissions from vehicles would be, for example, within this command and control approach. There are also other standards. For example, the government can decide to put in place various product standards or various technological standards. Also, the planning policies are also part of this command and control approach. So as you can see, this command and control approach is very good because you're setting binding targets and standards. And then in cases of non-compliance, you're using your enforcement mechanisms. But also what is quite important that the governments are using a mixture of regulatory approaches. Command and control is just one of them. Usually with the command and control, you're having different standards that you use. For example, information policies and voluntary approaches. And we probably all somehow saw some example of information policies. We're all, for example, aware that very often various products are accompanied by various labels. Those labels sometimes are showing to us if we're, for example, looking at an eco product, or, for example, it would give us more information about what is contained in the product. So these are also important approaches that we have in regulating environment and energy. So having those information policies are quite important. Sometimes you would have advice programs, which is another example of an information policy. So for example, you want to use a particular energy package, and there is an advice program that you can have a look, and you can make an informed decision about what you want to do. Also, very often you could have a product information footprint, which is essentially an information about the footprint of a product through its life cycle, from when it's a raw material to what it becomes a product. So you can see, for example, what are the emissions in designing and manufacturing a certain product. And then voluntary approaches are quite important. The government is usually trying to target big polluters and trying to enter into voluntary agreements with big polluters to incentivize big polluters to pollute less. And they always get something in return. So that's the basis of that relationship. And there are examples where, for example, the governments will work with industry and trying to reduce the footprint of particular industries and participants in those industries. But one thing that we're seeing around the world is that the governments are more and more focusing on renewable sources of energy, because the best way to mitigate climate change and the best way to reduce carbon emissions is essentially to switch to renewable sources of energy. And this is my list. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but this is a list of renewable sources that we're essentially deploying around the world. So you can see the first one is wind, onshore and offshore, and this is the beauty of wind, that you can essentially, it could be on the land, but also it could be in a water environment. And it depends on what is the geographical position of countries. Sometimes you can have both, sometimes you can only have one. Solar energy also very well deployed around the world. And then we have hydroelectric, tidal, biomass, geothermal, and gas-based renewable sources. Of course, some of those sources, such as geothermal, will depend on the natural resources that a country have. Not every country has potential for geothermal, but some countries do. For example, Indonesia would be one of the countries. Kenya would be another country with really vast sources of geothermal. And this is just a graph that you can see how, and I'm sorry, it's not very visible, but you can essentially see that solar PV technology is mostly deployed, followed by an onshore wind power. So you can see that this is how this deployment of renewable energy is going, and this is the International Energy Agency data. You can see it there in the right-hand side. But one thing that we have to bear in mind when we're talking about renewable energy is of course, there are a lot of benefits associated with renewable energy. And that's why the regulator is quite keen to use renewable energy. There is no doubt that in terms of carbon emissions and greenhouse gases emission, renewable energy is an excellent example how we can essentially cut the carbon emissions and other greenhouse gases emissions. Of course, bear in mind that there are still some greenhouse gases emissions when you're producing, for example, a solar panel in the process of manufacturing. But once you install a solar panel, we don't have any emissions of greenhouse gases. So I think there is a huge advantage when we think about mitigation and how we can use renewable energy. Also bear in mind that when we talk about renewable energy, they're really important because they form part of an energy mix. I mean, every country needs to diversify. You know, fossil fuel is not a long-term solution. So every country needs to think about energy mix. And also having renewable energy in place, you are essentially more robust and resilient. So you have an additional source of energy, which is quite important. Today, energy resilience is really an important thing to bear in mind. And also bear in mind that the impact on the environment and human health is definitely of a lesser extent when it comes to renewable sources of energy. I'm not saying that there are no impact, and I'll come to that in a second. There are definitely some impacts on the environment, but they're definitely not of the same extent as we would have, for example, with the use of oil and gas. But as I said, there are some challenges when it comes to renewable energy, and we should always be aware of that. There are advantages and disadvantages of this. I think when we speak about, let's say, disadvantages or challenges, I think challenges is a better word. We should definitely think that some of the renewable energy technologies are still expensive, though the costs are definitely declining. So, for example, the costs for solar PV technology or some of the wind energy are definitely declining. So this is becoming a more affordable source of energy for everyone. And it's being used in households around the world. One of the, I guess, challenges definitely would be public opposition. In some countries, there is certainly a greater opposition to use of some of the renewable energy sources. And think about it, if you think about the solar parks, one of the reasons why public would be against it would be, for example, for the aesthetic reasons. It definitely has this negative visual effects. And think about if your solar park is very close to a very scenic place of natural, or for example, natural beauty place, definitely there is this kind of public opposition to projects such as this one. Also, some of the sources of renewable energy, for example, such as wind, definitely have an impact on birds, for example. In cases of offshore wind farms, again, would definitely have an impact on mammal life and marine life and biodiversity. So these are important things to bear in mind when we speak about renewable sources of energy. I guess another challenge that it's worth of mentioning is the fact that it also depends, the use of and deployment of renewable energy depends on the political commitment, because the government has to invest and has to commit to very ambitious targets. So whether you will have a wide deployment of renewable energy certainly depends on a national government. Some governments are quite keen, some governments are less keen. And also bear in mind the government has to deploy public funds to research and development, because research and development is really important for a development of these technologies, and also for to decline the costs, because in time the costs are declining as technology is evolving. So this is also something to bear in mind. I guess another challenge when we speak about renewable sources of energy is the fact that you do have to have specialized skills and knowledge. So these are really very specialized jobs. And of course, there is always a worry that the jobs will disappear. So if we completely shut down the fossil fuel industry, but there is an opportunity for what we call green jobs, but they're highly specialized. So I think one of the important things to bear in mind that anyone who is involved, and I'm speaking here as a lawyer, we also have to have some knowledge of this science as lawyers, because we're essentially part of this various agreements, for example, that the project developers are entering in when they're thinking about using the renewable sources of energy. So as you can see, all of us, lawyers, engineers, we all have to have some specialized knowledge. So that's why it's really important that if you're thinking about this area of law, that you specialize. And this is what we are trying, for example, to do through this distance learning program, where we're trying to have a very, very specialized course for those who are interested. And again, I guess the final challenge that I wanted to mention is that this is one of the areas where government needs to have what we call the public-private partnership. So the government needs to engage the private sector. And private sector is actually quite interested, because this is for them a perfect opportunity. So I think this is also one of the challenges that we see, to what extent governments are capable and willing to engage with the private sector. But as a lawyer, just a few things I want to say. These are some common legal issues that we will see with regards to any of those renewable sources of energy that I mentioned previously. So, and this is something that we have to bear in mind. And if you're deciding one day to practice law, and you're thinking about this as an area of law, this is definitely issues that you would be dealing with. So one of the issues that come up with any source of renewable energy is land use and land ownership. So you would be helping your client in a way to deal with the ownership rights, because very often you want to install your source of renewable energy on a land which is not yours. It belongs to someone else. So you have to think about various legal issues surrounding the land use, to think about the lease agreements, to think about the easements, various other issues. Sometimes think about it when it's a geothermal energy. The question might be, who owns the sources beneath the earth? Usually it's the state. Then you as a lawyer are helping your client to get into a kind of relationship with the government to get a concession on various lease agreements. So as you can see, these are very complicated issues when it comes to the ownership of the land. I think where lawyers get really involved, especially are in this planning process and development contracts. So planning phase is quite complicated, where you essentially have to address various issues. And I just gave example here. Let me just show you the slide. So these are examples that you can see the offshore and onshore wind farms. And for example, for both of those projects, planning phase is quite difficult because there's so many things you have to think about and so many things you have to address in your planning application. So if you're thinking about, for example, the offshore wind farm, you have to think about the depth of the sea, you have to think about the wind power, you have to think about whether this is a special region in terms of marine biodiversity, you have to think about fishing rights, naval rights, so on and so forth. And this all forms part of the planning application that your lawyer is helping you with. Bearing in mind the finance is also quite important. It is expensive to invest initially in some forms of renewable energy, less so with solar and wind. As I said, the costs are declining, but geothermal is quite expensive because first you have to explore the area to see whether there is a potential. And then, you go on to everything else that comes to develop a project and so on and so forth. So finances are quite important. I already mentioned and touched upon the point of public support. So as I mentioned, you have to deal with, that there will be an opposition and your lawyer will be helping you with dealing with the public opposition, how to get people on your side if we're talking about project that really should go on. As you know, the aim of all of these sources of energy is to generate the energy. So you have to, in a way, as a lawyer, help your client to get access to the grid, to have what we call power purchase agreements with the off-taker who is going to sell the energy that you generate. So these are all very, if I can say, tricky legal issues that we're dealing with when it comes to renewable energy. And this just shows you that you have to also have a national infrastructure, especially national grid has to be robust to have the renewable sources of energy. Also, we have to think about the energy storage. So where do we store the energy that we generate? Sometimes when we have a small scale project, for example, in your household, you have a wind turbine, then you can store it in a battery. But if we're talking about big, investment and development projects where you have, wind farms, which are really vast, then energy is quite important. And then I will finish with the last thing, record keeping and monitoring. And then I will open floor for questions. Record keeping and monitoring is also quite important because the government has to keep a record of all renewable energy projects. Why? Because for environment, it's quite important to think about the cumulative effects. So think about if you have one region where you have, for example, 4 wind farms. You're not only thinking about what is the impact of one farm, but you're thinking, okay, but what is the cumulative impact of 4 wind farms for our bird population in that particular region? So that's why record keeping of, for example, zones where you can have renewable sources of energy, but then of installed projects is also quite important and something to bear in mind. And these are just some of the issues that you as a lawyer one day, if you want to engage with this, will be dealing with. And on that note, I want to thank you for listening to me. I hope this wasn't too long and boring. And I will open the floor for questions. I will stop sharing just that I can see the comments.
Aleksandra, I have the first question actually.
Please.
So you, with your exhaustive experience in this, I see climate change bill, climate change act, climate change council being in many countries. India is also one of them. I've sent you across the climate change bill that we had introduced in 2015.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Now, how many countries do you think are really serious in implementing it? Making a bill or an act is something, a process which people follow, legislators follow, or lawmakers follow, and then it is put on paper. Now, how many countries do you think in Europe or across the world are actually serious in implementing what is written in the act? This is my first question.
I think you're right. I think this is an excellent question because you're right. We do have a proliferation of national policies, national laws on climate change. But it's a bigger question, as you say, actually, do we enforce those laws? And I think this is, as you say, a weak link very often. And I think I can't give the exact number of the countries, but I think one of the things that I would say is that very often countries, I guess, do not enforce the legislation because it's too costly. I think that's the problem. Any climate change measure could be potentially quite costly, and they use the cost as an excuse for non-action. I sometimes think it's also the question of human resources. Very often, the human resources could be difficult at the national level, at the local level. But I don't think this is an excuse. I think we're in a situation where we can't choose. We definitely have to do something about climate change. And one thing that we see, I didn't say much about it because I didn't have time, but that brings me to something that you have implicitly mentioned. And this is the activism at the local level, at the national level. So what we are seeing is that around the world, especially young people, are essentially holding governments accountable. I think this is really important, because if we're going to have all these laws, they're actually completely obsolete unless they're enforced. And I think what we are seeing across the world, we're seeing domestic litigation where young people in particular are for the first time saying to the government, okay, so you have those laws, well, why don't we enforce them? And I think maybe that will be a push to not just have, as you say, something on paper, but actually having something really working in practice.
Okay. A further extension of this question I would like to ask is that now, typically in India, we don't have a political party who has a environment issue in their agenda, right? Okay, we have many political parties. We are not like Labour and Conservative. We don't have a two-party system here. We have hundreds of parties. Now, even the bigger parties don't have environment or climate change on their agenda. Do you, coming from UK, do you have both Labour and Conservative having something on their agenda, which is environmental or climate change as a point in their agenda? Are they promising during the election that they want to bring the carbon footprint to this, or they are going to adhere to the 2050 target? Do they actually talk about that?
Yes, I think. I can not only speak for the UK, but I would say for most of the let's say EU member states, they would have within their political agenda, they would have a section, if I can call it, on environment. And I think climate change is definitely the one. I think that it kind of varies to what extent they're committed to what they're saying. I think this is probably a difficult issue. So they all have some statement in their political agendas about climate change and environment. But I think when it actually comes to committing to what they say, of course, the extent to which they're committed to climate change will vary. But to answer your question, yes, I would say that nowadays all political parties in the UK do have some form of environmental agenda. To what extent they're ambitious in their climate change agenda, it's a different question. But yes, they would have something.
Okay. Now I'm going to ask a little bit about China. China is, of course, a huge problem when it comes to carbon footprint, and China is a place where you have the maximum industry, maximum production, apart from US. So what is the story of China? Are they adhering to it? Are they looking at it seriously? What is all about it?
I think if you look at I think the China is doing China definitely changed very significantly its own climate change policy. I think they, at least what I can in a way say from following the international climate change negotiations, I think they became quite engaged, I would say probably from 2009, from the Copenhagen negotiations and Copenhagen Accord. I think this was, at least to me, that would be a point in time when China changed its position dramatically in international negotiations. And I think from that point, I think they are making important strides. And I think one of the things about China is that it's important to look at the NDCs, their nationally determined contributions, their pledge under the Paris Agreement. I haven't seen the second one. I don't think they submitted it yet, but I knew when I was looking at the first nationally determined contributions that they submitted after the adoption of the Paris Agreement, it was quite ambitious. And I think they are they are following in many respects the EU example. You probably followed that they had the emission trading scheme, which was implemented, I think, initially in maybe 5-6 provinces. I'm not sure about the exact number, but they had this pilot project where they implemented the emission trading scheme in several provinces. And then I think 2 years ago, they launched a national emission trading scheme. So I think that they're definitely making important contribution at the international level. I think I guess one of the challenge for China, but not just for China, I think for very many countries, is to be less dependent on fossil fuel. I think this is something that is still an issue. I mean, I'll give you an example. So for example, in the EU recently, European Commission adopted a European Green Deal, which is essentially their environmental agenda, their environmental strategy. One of the big opponents was Poland, because they have a very important fossil fuel industry. So they were not interested in making any, I mean, they're interested, of course, in making a change, but they think it has to be gradual, it has to be much slower, because of course, they're worried about the job losses and everything else that comes.
Okay, now I'll come to the other part. Even 10 years back, Europe, if you go to Europe, most of the countries in Europe, you could see a lot of wind energy, right? Amsterdam, you go to the Netherlands and other parts of Europe, basically. Now, how has solar taken over? Has really solar, I saw in one of your graphs that solar has really taken over. So is it taking over at the pace that you feel is good enough? Or is there other energy sources in the renewable part, which you feel has a lot of promise and can bridge the gap? There is a gap there, I can easily see. Has wind energy increased the way it is, the intensity is right, or has it slowed down? Has solar taken it over? So what do you think about it?
I think at the moment, according to at least what I read relatively recently, according to IRENA's reports on renewable energy, I think solar is still best placed in terms of renewable energy. And Asia is the continent which actually has the widest deployment of renewable energy. So I think this is something really important. I think wind energy is a second as I would call it, second most widely deployed source of renewable energy. I think at the moment onshore is much better deployed than offshore. I think the reason for that is purely monetary, because offshore wind farms are much more expensive to install, and also it's not only that they're more expensive, but the installation process is more complex and difficult. So I think onshore farms are very widely deployed, and I would say that in Europe, solar and wind farm are equally deployed. Some countries, such as, for example, Iceland, are very famous for its geothermal energy. And for example, Iceland is one of the countries which essentially is almost 100%, if not 100%, the energy is generated from renewable sources. So I would say that, to answer your question, I would say that definitely solar and then wind, but then with wind, we have to make a distinction between onshore. So onshore is much better placed than offshore. I have a question here. Do you think that adopting and applying common environmental law with common punishment for violation will help in solving the problem? I'm in two minds when it comes to punishment. I sometimes think when it comes to environmental control, I think environmental law, I definitely think that what I call command and control approach, where we have standards and then we have, sentencing if you don't follow those standards. So there are sanctions in place if you don't follow. I think that any kind of, if I can call them traditional punishment mechanisms for compliance, have to be essentially coupled with voluntary compliance when it comes to environmental law. I think with environmental law, it's really important that you change also the behavior of people. I don't think it's just, I mean, you can always sanction people. There is no doubt about it that, you know, we can always have some successful sanctioning policies. But I just generally think that when it comes to environmental law, the aim should be that we all change how we behave and how we think about the environment. And I think one of the probably important things when it comes to environmental law, and this is really an excellent question, is that we have to think about how we can educate even very young children in school, you know, what they're supposed to recycle, what they're not supposed to recycle, to change the way how, you know, how they behave. I think that's really important. So to answer your question, I think it would be quite important to have the sanctioning policy in cases of non-compliance, but I will also sorry, I'm just looking at but I will also couple it with the voluntary mechanisms of compliance. As I say, I'm not too keen on just pure punishment. I think we're all very reasonable, and I think if we are given sufficient information, I think this is quite important when it comes to environmental law, the transparency of information. So, do we know what are the risks? I think this is important. Do we know what are the risks? Do we know how we're going to address the risks? Then I think, you know, people are changing the way how they behave. And of course, I mean, COVID is definitely, I would say, an important landmark in how environmental law will develop, will continue to develop in many countries, because it's a question in many countries now with COVID, to what extent governments will stay committed to environmental measures, because as we know, the economy is suffering, and all the governments now have to make a decision between measures which are going to boost the economy and measures which are going to offer environmental protection. So we're heading into difficult times.
Shrinkala, you have another question. I think another of the attendees have a question. Can you ask?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
It's from Ashita. Isn't it about time countries should be held accountable for all their actions against environment, like major oil spill taking place in Russia? What can be done to make laws stringent globally?
I think both of your questions are essentially around this issue of enforcement at the international level. And it's a really excellent question, because I think when we speak about international environmental law, the problem is the enforcement, because there is actually no enforcement. Enforcement only depends on the willingness of states to accept the jurisdiction of a particular court. So I think this is a really very difficult question, and I definitely think that companies should be responsible for various oil spills, regardless of what they happen in the world. But the problem is that very often to find international company to be liable for damage at the international level is very difficult, because as we know, at the international level, states are primary subjects of international law. But, you know, there are some strides, especially when it comes to oil pollution. We're looking at this concept of civil liability. When it comes to nuclear pollution, nuclear incidents, we again have the possibility of civil liabilities. Also, some countries have laws in place which are quite important when we're having an environmental damage which is caused by multinational companies. But to answer your questions, yes, I agree with you. I think that when we look at the international environmental law, unfortunately, of course, the weak point is that enforcement.
Any other questions, Shrinkala, we have?
No more questions, sorry. No more questions.
Okay. Okay, Professor Cavoski, I think fantastic.
Thank you very much for everything. It was my pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And we will be back with University of Birmingham webinar on 7th of December. And watch out for the space. And thank you, Benjamin, for being there. And we'll see you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.